The final set of moral theories we'll look at are those involving ethical relativism, and this also includes ethical subjectivism. The basic idea is this. For the ethical relativist and the subjectivist, ethics is not objective. That is to say, there's no universal ethics that is correct, across the board. In the case of ethical relativism, the typical version is that the correctness of moral claims, and they can be correct or incorrect in a certain context, depends on cultural acceptance. There can be other versions of this, but kind of the standard version of ethical relativism links morality to a culture. To use a pretty standard analogy, this makes ethics rather like law. When you think of law, there is, on Earth, there's no universal world law that objectively applies to everyone. There's law in each particular area, depending on the jurisdiction. So in the United States, for example, you would have federal law that covers the entire United States. Then you have state law that covers particular states, but doesn't extend beyond them. Then you'd have laws governing particular counties, then the city level, and then maybe even in smaller divisions within the city, depending on how it's set up. And so when you're in a particular zone of law, say in a particular state, something is legal means that it's set as being legal by the relevant authorities of that state. And something illegal is something that's set by the authorities of the state as being illegal. And of course, in the case of the law, you could be standing on the border in one state doing something perfectly legal and then step over across the border and nothing about you has changed except for your location, and now you could be doing something illegal. For example, if one state allows for, say, legal possession of, fireworks, and you have, some fireworks in your hand, and you're being perfectly legal when you're in that state, but if you cross the border to another state where it's illegal, you're now breaking the law, even though, again, nothing about what you're doing has changed except your location. Now, in the case of ethical relativism, morality works like that. So when you're within a culture and you're doing something that the culture accepts as good, then it's good. If you do something the culture accepts as bad, then it's bad. And if you happen to, going back to the legal example, if you happen to step across the cultural border, we'll just use a geographical border to make it simple, then you could go from doing something morally okay, then moving into another culture, suddenly what you're doing is morally unacceptable, simply because you're in a different culture now. And again, this works rather like law, except morality in place of law. Now, there are other differences, of course, like in the case of law, you have police and you've got judges and you've got, state governing bodies, legislatures, Congress, etc. In the case of morality, you typically don't have that. So those are some important differences. Now, in the case of subjectivism, this makes the correctness of moral claims depend on the acceptance of the individual. That is to say, whatever the individual accepts is good because they accept it. Whatever they regard as bad because they reject it. And a common analogy here is with taste in food, or in some cases you could use an analogy to art, but that becomes more controversial. So we'll just stick with food. So whether food is delicious or yucky to you depends on you. It's how it tastes to you. So if you like, for example, anchovies on your pizza, then it's delicious to you. But if someone else doesn't like that taste and thinks it's, yucky, then it's yucky to them. So subjectivism makes morality rather like taste in food. In a sense, everyone's right and nobody's wrong, because you like what you like, you dislike what you dislike. Now, proponents of ethical relativism include Herodotus, who we'll look at, and Gilbert Harman, a much more recent philosopher. So, what is the main argument, or a main argument, for relativism? Well, one of the arguments commonly given for it, which tries to give it a pretty good run, is a two premise, one conclusion argument. One conclusion, of course, because all arguments have one and only one conclusion. And this is taken from Postman, who is known for writing a lot of textbooks on ethics and other subjects. So the first step, the first sort of premise, is the diversity thesis. And this is a anthropological hypothesis and not itself a moral theory. It's a empirical, thesis about matters of fact. And it's this statement that what is considered morally right and wrong varies from society to society. So, there are no moral principles accepted by all societies. And on the face of it, that seems fairly reasonable. Because if you travel to different cultures, you'll find that ethics varies quite a bit, or so it would seem. Now, by itself, again, that's just the scientific hypothesis. It says nothing about what is really wrong or right, good or bad. And so we need the second step, which is what is called the Dependency Thesis. And this is the thesis that all moral principles derive their correctness, their validity, from cultural acceptance. And this is a philosophical hypothesis, which rather than just describing how things are scientifically, it is describing how ethics works philosophically. So if you combine those together, what is considered morally right and wrong varies from culture to culture. And secondly, that moral principles get their validity from cultural acceptance. What follows is the conclusion of relativism. Therefore, there are no universally valid moral principles. That is to say, there are no objective standards which apply to all people, everywhere, and all times. So relativism would be true. Now, subjectivism, as I noted before, goes beyond this. For the subjectivist, the validity of moral principles would depend entirely on individual acceptance. And that view is pretty extreme. So why do people like ethical relativism? Well, one appeal is that relativism, just broadly speaking, that truth is relative, is often popular. This goes through cycles. Even during my lifetime, which has not ended yet, I hope, is, I've seen relativism come in and be really popular, where people say, it's all relative. Then it kind of goes out of fashion sometimes and comes back in. But depending on the appeal of relativism, that, things like art, fashion, etc., is all relative. It seems to, follow that, well, if, how people dress and what they eat is relative to the culture, hey, why not ethics? Second, the diversity thesis seems to be plausible, that if you travel around the world in the 7 seas, I guess there are 8 now, then you would see that people differ quite a bit in their ethics. Third, in terms of nice things about that seem to be a function of relativism that might appeal to people, is that on the face of it, ethical relativism seems to avoid what's called ethnocentrism. And ethnocentrism is an uncritical belief in the inherent superiority of one's own culture. The idea that one's culture is simply right because it's one's culture. And of course, if ethical relativism is true, then no culture is superior to any other. All would be equally, moral by definition. There's also the view that it seems to justify tolerance. There's an anthropologist, Melville Herskovits, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, and he advances a tolerance argument in favor of relativism. And here's how the argument goes. The first premise is that if morality is relative to its culture, then there's no independent basis for criticizing the morality of any other culture. You can only criticize your own culture. Second, if there is no independent way of criticizing any other culture, we ought to be tolerant of the moralities of other cultures. Then the third step, it's assumed that morality is relative to its culture, and so therefore we ought to be tolerant of the moralities of other cultures. And this does seem to have a certain appeal to it, because looking at the argument, if we do accept moral relativism, then it would seem to follow we should be tolerant. And if we believe that tolerance is a good thing, then we would say, yay to relativism. So that is the sort of general introduction to relativism. And next we'll turn to our example from our good dead friend Herodotus in his discussion of how custom is king.